drunk. He once played Eruption on a tambourine.
This is factual stuff that happened.
Trunk Nation.
Sirius XM.
It's in my blood.
Volume.
Alrighty, welcome back everybody to Trunk Nation here on Sirius XM Volume 106, talking rock with you every day. It is Eddie Trunk, and this is a guy that, as I said earlier, so many people have asked me about. You got to get him on the show. He's got what's going on with him. We're going to get answers to all those questions. He's also an old friend who I have a tremendously long history with, and it's always great to talk with him. It's been far too long. We welcome now to the show Blackie Lawless. How are you, bud? Blackie.
Yes.
There you are.
Good.
Good to hear from you, man. You've been holding up through all these crazy couple of years we're dealing with.
Well, you know, like everybody else, you just keep putting one foot forward in front of the other and hope for the best.
Yeah, that's all you can do, and it's nothing but conflicting information as to tours that are starting, tours that aren't starting. Have you, during this time of COVID and so many artists locked down, tell me about what you've been doing creatively. I know we're going to talk about a tour here in a second, but what have you been doing? Because as a songwriter, I imagine that you got some good material. This is a cause for some good material around now.
It is, but at the same time, I was one of the first people that contracted this stuff. And it was kind of a bizarre thing because James Hetfield was having a showing at the Peterson Museum here in L.A. for his cars. And I hadn't been anywhere in quite some time. So I thought, okay, I'm a car guy. So went down to see the cars. What we weren't anticipating when we got there is that we found out later it was the single largest event in the history of the Peterson Museum. There was like 1,000 people there and a lot of fans. So as soon as we walked in the door, it turns into a little bit of an in-store appearance. And so people wanting photos and just to say hello and things like that. Well, when you're taking photos and all that, everybody gets up close and everybody's breathing on everybody else.
Yep.
So we'd go to the show, everything's fine. About a week later, I start feeling kind of tough. And I thought, a couple of days into it, I thought, well, I've got the flu. Well, about 4 days in, which normally you would start feeling better, I wasn't. So I thought, well, tomorrow I'll feel better. And the next day I get up, I was worse. And I thought, well, this is a bad one. I'll be better tomorrow. Got to the next day, I was even worse than that. So this goes on for about 7-8 days. And I'm getting at the end of my rope, and I'm thinking, what the hell is this? And then I lose my taste and smell and all that. That went on for like 2 more weeks after that. But we don't know what this is because there's no name for it yet. I mean, this is still, it was the end of January in 2020. So then I started getting better, but it goes on for weeks and weeks. And so we didn't know what it was. Then we start hearing this rumbling that there's something out there with this, this funny name on it. So, about 3 months, it took really a better part of 3 months to really shake it. So after that time, then I decided, to start working a little bit and, got us to the point basically where we are now. And I've got quite a bit of material that we've been working on, quite diligently, actually.
Well, before we get to there's a lot to talk about because you really haven't done any interviews and you've really been very much, for the most part, off the radar here in the U.S., which is why, I've reached out to you a few times in recent years and said, hey, do you want to come on? Because the fans are always asking about you, asking what you're up to. And I've told them all repeatedly, hey, WASP works in Europe and you do a lot of stuff outside of America, but you really haven't done a lot in the U.S. That's all about to change, which is what we're going to talk about today, among other things. But fill everybody in, Blackie, on what you've been doing and the news that you're about to announce about a tour that you're about to embark on here in the U.S.
Well, this goes back really a few years. We did the last European tour in 2017. When we did that, the word got out in America that it was happening, and the fan base really decided that they wanted to see this band back in the United States. Now, we're kind of a strange band in the sense that our following is ravenous, and I cannot overestimate that. The following that we have, I mean, at no point in our history have WASP ever been the biggest band in the world. But the following that we do have, it's almost cult-like. So what these guys did, out of the goodness of their heart, a couple of thousand of them in the United States decided to get together all at one time. They all started talking to each other. They started reaching out to promoters. I've never seen anything like this happen before. And what they did is they created an awareness in the promoters' minds that really facilitated or got this ball rolling. And so, first and foremost, I want to say thank you to everybody that did that, because, you know, for the longest time, it's been 10 years since we played in the United States. And everybody says, well, why don't you play here? Do you not want to play here? What's going on? I don't know of a band around. I've never met a band that if you gave them a good tour to do would refuse it. And we're no different. But it's a question of putting the right things together. But it's also those promoters believing that there's an audience out there to be had. So, like I said, we go back to the fan base on this. The interest and the fervor they created lit this fuse back in 2017. And it's been going on ever since. So we signed with TKO, the booking agency, one of the bigger booking agencies in the United States. They reach out to some top flight promoters around the country, and because of that, I'm proud to say we begin, for the first time in 10 years, October of this year, the 40th anniversary tour of WASP. Back
And that's,
on US soil.
and that, well, now I have those dates, and this is all going to hit with a press release in about 20 minutes here, but we're breaking it here on this show, and I appreciate you coming on and doing that. A couple questions on that, Blackie. You talked about the passion of your fan base who drove this thing back in 2017. We all know there's a lot of bands that have passionate fans that really want to see them live. Where do you, but you're saying your fans really went the extra mile here. What do you think that you've done or WASP has done in your career, musically, connecting with the fans, whatever the case may be, that has generated fans that passionate? Where do you think it comes from? What do you think the connection is that's so strong to you and the band?
First and foremost, I think it's honesty. And I think that would be the case with any artist. What are you saying? And in this particular case with me, this goes back to prior to us recording The Headless Children. Because I went through a period after we finished the record prior to that, which was Inside the Electric Circus. We had been on the road for about 3 or 4 years at that point. We'd done a record and a tour and a record and a tour and a record and a tour. You get out of that cycle, and you're literally punch drunk. You feel like you've been 15 rounds at a champ and lost every round. You know, I mean, you don't know who you are. Right around that point, we came off the road. I went into a bank to cash a check. This is a true story. I went in there. I was standing in front of the teller. I wrote out the check for the amount that I wanted, signed it, did everything. I got to the date. I started writing the date out, and it was like March 20th. I got to the year, and I stopped. And the teller's looking at me. And about 15, 20 seconds goes by, and he told me what year it was. He realized I didn't know the year. And when he told me that, I thanked him for it. Since I've told that story, I've had other musicians tell me similar things. Something bothering me, and he was real quiet. And so after about an hour, him not really engaging, I said, what's going on? He says, I just got news that Marvin Gaye was murdered last night. And so he started telling me that he had done a couple of records with Marvin. And so I just let him talk for a while. I mean, we didn't work, we didn't do anything. And he told me, he says, I learned one thing from Marvin. He says that any artist, whatever they're doing, that record they're doing at that moment should reflect who they are and what they're thinking. Not what's going on in the charts, not what's hot out there or whatever's in vogue, any of that. Who are you? What do you have to say that's authentic? Because you can't try to I mean, if you're making pop music, that's one thing, and there is a place for that. But if you're trying to communicate to an audience, and you're the kind of person that you're going to develop a lifelong kinship with an audience, and you're going to take them on that lifelong ride, they have to feel like they know you intimately. You have to allow those people the freedom, literally, to take off their shoes and start walking around inside your head to find the good, the bad, some of the stuff maybe you don't want to know, but all that stuff is reflected in the lyrics. And when you display that type of honesty, that endears people to you.
Blackie, let me just
key to any artist.
Let me jump in on that. As a songwriter, is that a difficult thing for you to do? For you to be that open? Would you prefer to write in character, or is that, I imagine, to open yourself up to be that honest in your lyrics with what's going on at that time is not easy to do? Would I be spot on that, or is it? Is it more therapeutic?
At times you are correct, because writing is always a discovery process. When I wrote The Crimson Idol, everybody asked me when that record was finished, well, who is that character? Is it you? And I said no. I said, this is a guy, he's a half a dozen different guys I know in the music industry. He's a little of this guy, a little of that guy, a little something else, maybe 10% of me. And I rolled them all together, and that's who you get. Well, years go by, and I realized there was far more of me in him than I ever gave it credit for. Now, I'm not saying 100%, but way more than I thought there was. So that's a process of self-discovery. But as a person, as a writer, you've got to be, like Peter Gabriel said, digging in the dirt to find the places where we got hurt. You've got to be willing to go into those places. I went into that spot when I was making that record, and I stayed there for about 2 years. And when I came out of it, it was cathartic, and not necessarily in a good way. There was things I discovered about myself, my childhood, things like that, and it's like I'm finished with a project, and I'm thinking, why the hell do I feel the way I feel right now? I don't feel so great. How did this happen? Because you're uncovering a lot of stuff, but I know you have to be willing to share that with people. And there's some artists out there that don't want to do that. And hey, you know what? If they're successful and they don't have to, more power to them. But for myself, I found that is the key to really locking in that relationship with a fan base across the board. I really don't know any other way to do it.
Yeah, and if people really know the WASP catalog and know your work as a writer, they know that that's been a theme throughout, because when you're talking, Blackie, about heavy moments and things and writing about them, and I mentioned to my audience before, you and I go way, way back. I mean, I think you were my first interview when the first record came out, and we talked about that very funny story back in '83. But since then, we've always been in touch, and I'll never forget when you came into my studio, and this is now 20 years ago, in New York City, right after 9/11, and of course you're originally from New York. And I remember the impact that had on you coming into my studio. You met some of my friends who were police officers, and I remember you were really impacted by that. And I do recall that the next record came out, "Dying for the World," and there was stuff on that record that was very connected to that, including a brilliant song called "Hallowed Ground" about that. I imagine that experience. So I actually witnessed that firsthand, how that manifested itself in the music you were making.
I don't see how anybody could witness what we all saw at that time and not feel moved by it. And you recall I had my dad with me at the time, and I remember the day prior to coming in to do your show, the World Series was going on. That was the reason we were there. But before the game, we went down to Ground Zero. And the thing that hit me the most that day was that smell, that electrical smell of burning wires. It was everywhere. You couldn't escape it. And so we were down there for an hour and a half maybe, and we left and got something to eat before we went to the stadium. And I remember my nose draining while I was eating, and I could taste those burning wires in the back of my throat. That freaked me out. I'd never experienced anything like that before. And so how can someone experience something like that and not be moved? Then the next day we come in your studio, and you were talking about the police that were in there, and they've got that 1,000-yard stare. And again, you're constantly being assaulted everywhere you turn with the faces that you're looking at. Not to mention that this is not just me witnessing this at the moment. This goes back into my childhood. I mean, I grew up over in Staten Island. I had family members that walked the steel on those buildings when those things were going up. So anybody that has a history there, they're going to take that very, very personal.
Yeah. I want to talk to you specifically about this tour, because this is the big news, and this is the exciting news for all the fans that have been asking me, and like you said, asking you about U.S. activity for WASP. But and we have plenty of time here, so we'll get into specific dates and specifics about the tour here in a second. But I got about 2-3 minutes before I have to hit a break. I'm curious, Blackie, you had said that this fan swell started in 17. Is the reason why we're getting these shows in the U.S. in 2022 really just because that's how long it took to put together? And I imagine because we've lost a couple years of touring because of COVID, would this have happened sooner if it wasn't for the pandemic?
I couldn't really answer that because we weren't scheduled to do anything prior to this. But to get this to the point of where it is now didn't start yesterday. I mean, to start building this has been about a year in the making to get to the point where we are now. So just to start that process, there's a decent amount of time before that where I have to find the right agent. I have to find the right press team to put together. I mean, things aren't exactly the way they used to be when major labels were around. Any band today is going to have those people working with them. You create a network of doing that kind of stuff. So it's a little different than it used to be, and you have to learn to adapt and, how you're going to put your team together, and do you have the people you trust? Are they good? That sort of thing. But it was, like I said, this wasn't created overnight. So this took a while to get this to the point where the promoters were seeing from the fan base the interest that was being generated. That seed was planted, but I also think that seed needed time to grow in their heads and the promoters' heads to understand that, yes, there is something to be had there. And, I'm happy to say a number of guys across the U.S. have stepped up to make this happen as far as the promoters.
Yeah, and you've always said to me that you're not going to go out and play WASP shows unless it's the right venue, unless you can bring your gear in, unless you can present it in the right way. You're not going to be somebody that's going to do a throw and go in a little club, and you want it to be at the level that people would expect from WASP. So that's part of it too.
Because YouTube has changed everything. So what people film today, at a show, that's up online at night. So somebody in Czechoslovakia or the Czech Republic is seeing a show that was recorded in Kansas City yesterday. And that networking exists all over the world now, so there's no way. It's pretty hard to hide things now when it comes to that. In the old days, artists or labels could move publicity in the direction they wanted. But you can't do that now. So if we're going to do something in one part of the world, I have every reason to believe that someone that's in Nashville, Tennessee, or Orlando, Florida, or wherever they may be, they're going to go online, they're going to look at those shows that were being done in bigger venues, and if you're not doing that, when you get to their town, they're more than likely going to be disappointed. I would be.
Yeah. Hey, man, I hate to cut in on you, but I got to do a quick break here. I'm going to put you on hold. We'll come right back, okay? All right, we'll put Blackie on hold. We'll come right back after the top of the hour with a lot more with Blackie Lawless, including your calls right after this on Trunk Nation. This situation, because obviously there is a big catalog of WASP songs. You want to celebrate the catalog, but also from a production standpoint, because many people know WASP is synonymous with big shows and many of the things that you've done over the decades. So what can fans expect to see and hear on this tour?
Well, the first thing you would want to discuss when we are in production meetings is, what are we going to play? And I think it's understandable that you would want to do what is going to be considered the things that are mandatory. I mean, if we don't play I Want to Be Somebody, there's going to be a riot, and it's understandable. I get that. But, we're doing the better part of 2 hours. That gives me a chance to do some stuff I've never done. And what I mean by that is there are songs in the catalog that we have never played live before. And I want to get into some of those. But equally as important with that, when we had our first production meeting a couple of months ago about it, we realized that there wasn't going to be enough time to do everything we wanted to do. Now, normally we don't do this because whatever show you put together, because your production value, rehearsals, things like that, you don't really want to start getting off the script too far. But we're making a conscious effort at this point to vary that show a little bit from night to night. So if we're doing multiple nights in a given city, let's say you're going to do 2 or 3 nights in the same place, the show's going to be a little bit different every night. We're doing that for the fans, but we're also doing it to pay respect to that catalog. And it might be a little on the self-indulgent side, but we're going to play stuff that we think people would want to hear and be pleasantly surprised. You're always going to have people that are going to want to hear obscure B-sides and things like that, and I get that. But for the most part, when we've tried things like that in the past before, there's a handful of people in the front that are going, yeah, that's great. But you see, a confused look on the face of 95% of the audience, so you have to really be careful not to overindulge with stuff like that. But we're going to be careful to make sure that whatever we do when we go off the script is going to be something people are going to want to hear. And I'll be further honest with you at this point. We're going to need to get into rehearsal to find out what's going to work and what isn't. Because if it's material, some of it that we've never played before, I think every band's had the experience of being in a studio and something really sounding great when they're there, but when they try to recreate it live, it falls on its face for whatever reason. And at the same time, you also have some stuff you think are sleepers that this may not translate. And you're pleasantly surprised there when it does, but it's a little strange. And you also have to remember that any band that is the band that's been around for a long time, after your first 2 or 3 records and you've been established, every time you do an album after that, that album ends up becoming the opening act. Because when when that new record comes out, people already have in their heads what they're coming to that show to hear. So when that new record comes out, that new record gets treated like an opening act. Nobody knows them. Mm-hmm. And so for that new record to stand up to the old material, it's got to be quality stuff. So it'll be a little bit like that with this as well. So we won't know until we get in there, but I do feel very certain that there's going to be maybe 25% of this show things we've never played before. So I'm looking forward to that aspect of it. Visually, when we did Inside the Electric Circus, my original idea for that tour was to make it look like an old circus sideshow, almost like a freak show. Well, because we were doing arenas, the general consensus from everybody involved was that it wasn't big enough. It wasn't flashy enough. So it started being built bigger and bigger and bigger, and it morphed into something that was very, very bright, filling up a big space. And I regretted that over the years because it got so far away from my original vision, it turned into a rock band playing Las Vegas. And it was big and it was bombastic, but it wasn't what my original idea was. We're going back to that idea now because we felt that idea encapsulated a lot of the things that we were doing in the beginning. So when people see this thing, they're going to walk into the room. The production is going to be kind of semicircle on the stage. You're going to see all kinds of, like the old sideshow banners that used to show the sword swallower, and the snake lady and things like that. The drums are going to be built onto bales of hay. So you're going to see all those elements, but you're going to smell that stuff too. We hope when you walk in. What we're trying to do is when you walk in the door, it's almost like you're walking through the flap of a circus tent. We want you not just to be in the audience, we want you to feel like you're actually in this thing as if you were part of an old circus inside of an old circus tent.
I did a big special recently with Nikki Sixx for his book, The First 21, and I'm sure you've heard about this by now, but he talks about his time meeting you very early on, playing with you very early on, and what an influence and impact that you had on him. And there's been other books that have come out recently, too, about the early WASP shows and what you were doing around Southern California with the raw meat and the rack and all of those things that was just beyond shocking at that time, just, blew people away. When you look back on that stuff in retrospect, how do you feel about it? And is that an element that you would reintroduce, given that this is a 40th anniversary tour?
There is elements of it that we will do, but it won't be the same way it was before. And I'm just going to leave it at that because I don't want to let too much out. We were faced with, and I'm going to be very honest, we were faced with the idea of, has the world's sensibilities changed from the time that we originally started doing this to now? The general consensus was, yes, it has changed. So we don't want to get into a situation where musically we're doing one thing and the visuals conflict with it. Because what we started doing in the beginning, we believed was social comment. And it astounded us that more people didn't get that idea. The only thing they saw was the bombast of the presentation we were doing. And I remember we would sit and we would scratch our heads and we would say, don't these people understand what we're trying to say here? And they weren't getting it. And so after a few records of that, I thought, you know what? The only way to get people to listen to what you're doing is you got to turn the visual down. Because anytime people go to a show, and it's natural, we all do it, people end up listening with their eyes more than their ears. And so, and I'll go back to the Crimson Idol for just a moment. I learned in the making of that record one of the things that made Bob Dylan what he was or is. And that Bob was Bob and an acoustic guitar. Whenever he had something really important to say, you could hear it, because he doesn't have, some insane rock and roll band blasting behind him at 9 million watts. So I took that cue when I did the Crimson Idol. When I thought I've got something really important to say, I turned that music down. And it was either some keyboard thing that I was singing with, or an acoustic guitar or something like that. Because, like I said, people most of the time are going to listen with their eyes and not their ears. So if you're really trying to hammer a point home, you have to do just that. You got to really drop breadcrumbs along the way and say, this is where we're going with this.
There's a song in the WASP catalog that you have not played for decades that when I told people you were coming on was the first thing they asked me to see if it would come back into the set. And that song, I'm sure you know where I'm going, is Animal.
Well, yeah.
What are your thoughts on that, and will that make a reappearance?
I don't know. There's a part of me that says it's already out there. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. Do I owe it to the fan base to really make this a true retrospect of what we've done? If I had to give you an answer right now, I would say I'm leaning in the direction of doing it.
Well, that'll make your fans happy, because that was the one that when I told people that you got to ask him if he's going to finally do it, is he going to finally do it? Why did you drop it initially, Blackie? Was it just it didn't feel comfortable for you anymore?
Two reasons. Number one, my religious convictions, but, my Christian faith. I thought, this is not really something that I want to say. But also there was another reason as well, that if we were doing more serious material, do you really want that conflict of messaging going on at the same time? So there was a twofold reason for it. And I think it's, really, we haven't played that song in quite some time. It's probably going on 15 years now. But however long it's been, I think I made my point. And so we're in the process we're discussing it. Let's put it that way.
Tell me about the band that you have going out with you. There's been a number of different lineups of WASP over the decades. Who do you have joining you on the tour? Who's the band going to be?
Well, Mike Duda is the longest tenure. Mike's been in the band 25 years now, the bass player. And Mike's tenure in the band is second only to myself. And Doug Blair is a guitar player. Doug's been with us 18 years. So the stability of this lineup has been pretty solid for a pretty long time. The drummer that we're using has been with us now for 6 years, Achilles Priester. And that lineup, like I said, if you look at the history of the band, without question, has been the most stable lineup we've ever had.
Do you have contact with other members of WASP in the past? And I couldn't not ask you about Chris Holmes. I'm sure you know there was a documentary. He's had some allegations there against you about not being paid on things. Do you have any response to that?
I don't really know much about. I spoke to Randy Piper a couple of years ago. I don't really know what's going on with the rest of the guys. And I'm not sure exactly what you're talking about with Chris about not being paid. Chris, at two different points in his musical career, received settlements from this band. He signed documents as such, and he was paid quite well. So I haven't seen what you're talking about. The answer I'm giving you right now is based on what you just said to me.
Well, there's a documentary,
really-
which I'm sure you haven't seen the documentary, but there's a documentary called Mean Man that's not just about his time with you, but that's a big part of it, obviously. But I'm assuming you haven't seen the documentary then.
No.
Okay. Well, in that, I mean, he talks about a lot. It's not just all you, but there's, he alleges that whether it's through you or others that, there's money and songwriting credits and what have you that he didn't get that he's due.
That is not true.
Let me ask you about the lineup of, the opening act. You're going to bring Armored Saint out with you as the opening act for the entire tour. And then and I'm extremely excited about this, in Texas and Oklahoma, your show in Tulsa, which is on November 6th, and then the Texas shows run November 2 through 5. The dates just came out. You've got Michael Schenker as a big UFO fan. That's exciting for me. What a double treat that is. WASP, Michael Schenker, Armored Saint in Texas and Oklahoma. The rest of the bill, the rest of the lineup is with Armored Saint. So talk about those decisions, if you will.
Well, we have a long history with Armored Saint. I mean, this too is their 40th anniversary, this tour. So we all go back to that magical period that was LA 82, 83. And we all rode that wave, and they were very much a part of that. And to have them back out with us again is great because, like I said, we rode that wave in 82 and 83. Everybody who got their deals, and a lot of times you really don't see anybody again after that at all, if ever. And if you do, sometimes it's only sporadically. But we were fortunate enough on our first U.S. tour in 85, we did a package with Armored Saint, WASP, and Metallica. And so we did 2 months of doing that. So, our paths have crossed over the years. And